Hello Natroners, and welcome back to another episode of VFX with the Natron. So today we're going to be exploring the difference between PNG and EXRs and why that might be important to some people, particularly people who use Blender, which is the most notorious program for abusing and breaking the PNGs now of currently. And you're saying to yourself, what are you talking about, Pirate Bill? How is Blender broken? And that's actually going to be the first thing we're going to talk about. I'm going to actually pull up Blender before we jump into Natron to show a little scene I made because of last week's episode where we was talking about PNGs and EXR files and the fact that with the Z-depth we had a problem with Mr. Thomas Morley's little depth of field issue there. And well, today we're going to be actually looking at Blender and seeing it. So yeah, let's get into Blender. Let's hop over here. So here we are in Blender, and you can see that we have a simple scene. In fact, it's pretty much the default scene. It's the cube. I modified the camera and stuff. Well, I was trying to mimic sort of the layout or a similar kind of layout to what Mr. Thomas Morley's little scene was last time, because we was having problems with the zDefocus node, and I wanted a reference. And after I was done rendering this out, I just want to I'm going to hit F12 here and render this. Whoa. I did the wrong thing here. Uh-oh. 1 second. Whoops. I was in the wrong spot. There we go. That's it. F12. There we go. We're rendering it out. Did the wrong thing in the wrong place. Ended up with weirdness off on the side. So just making sure nobody's looking. So alright. So here, this is an IV render. Or at least I think that's how you pronounce it. Anyway, EV is the new renderer. This would work with cycles just the same. This is a depth of field test. It's the cube. We can see we have some blur here, some depth of field, both in the back and in the foreground, and then our plane of focus is right down the middle. Okay, and it's not overly exciting, but it's all I needed for my test. All right, to do the defocus. Right, so there we go. So I also want to pop over and show our render settings. So if we look at our file, these are our render passes. If we look at our file output, we can see that I've set it up so that I'll have this thing, and I'm rendering this out at the base file as an EXR. Now, if I go over to the compositing tab right here, we can see that I've made a whole bunch of file nodes here to export each one of the passes. So I'll have a comp node, etc. I'll have all the different things: the image, the alpha, the depth, the mist, the normal, the shadow, the AO, etc., so on and so forth. Anyway, the two ones I'm mostly interested in today are going to be the mist and the depth. Why? Because the mist filter, or the mist pass, which I'll call fog last time because whatever, it doesn't matter. It's only exists in Blender because, well, honestly, the depth pass is actually broken. And you say, what? No, it's not. The depth pass works fine, Pirate Bill. Well, no, it doesn't. It doesn't work fine at all. It turns out that if we go, let's hop over into Natron, and I'm going to pull these up. So we're going to, here's Natron. Let me pull it up. Oops, that's the wrong thing. There's the thing. I want to, first of all, I've rendered this out, as I'll say, as EXRs and PNGs, or one EXR and a PNG. So we're going to first chuck in our EXR file and just look at this. All right, so this EXR file, if I pop it in here, there we go. We look at this. This is our render result. Looks just fine. I first want to talk about how we access things, because a lot of people, I didn't really go over this in the last episode because we were dealing with PNGs, but I wanted to show how people make mistakes with compositing Blender files and EXRs in particular inside of Natron. One of the big mistakes that a lot of people do is they put in a shuffle node. So let's put in a shuffle node and show how most people do it. They usually go shuffle, and they put in a shuffle node, and they go over here, and then they look through this catastrophic list of layers and layer names, trying to pick out the individual RGB passes and the alpha pass and everything out of this. That's not how you do it. Don't do it that way. That's terrible. I've always told people, don't do it that way. What you want to do is you just want to hit T. Give yourself a transform node. You go down here to where it says all planes, because you can try and do it here. We can go here and you can see here's all layers. But if we try to select it, like for example, what we're interested in looking at is this Z pass or the depth pass. And as soon as I do it, you'll see that it disappeared. And well, the problem is it didn't disappear. What happened is all planes is checked. We want to uncheck it, and you'll see that it did the output layer. We don't want to alter the output layer. We want to keep the output layer as RGB. We want to output an RGB from this node. What we want to do is change our source layer. So we want to go here to our source layer and change that to our Z depth, and there we go. Now, last time I pointed out that I had asked Mr. Thomas Morley whether he had rendered it as a depth pass or as a fog pass or a mist pass, as it's called. And he had said that it was a Z depth, and I was like, that's weird. It must have been something that he'd done in it. So here's the thing. First of all, this is what the Z pass or the depth pass looks like. This is the actual Z pass in an EXR file, and by the way, it works properly in an EXR file, and I'll show you what I mean in a little while. But this is what it looks like, and I'm going to just, for the sake of purposes, show also the mist pass, which is right here. This is what the mist pass, and this looks very much like Mr. Thomas Morley's, file from last week where we saw this. Okay, very similar pass. All right, which is why I was confused by when he told me that it was the depth. So anyway, this is the Z depth. Now, this is what it looks like in an EXR. And now I'm going to grab our PNGs. Now, the reason I wanted to bring this up first as the EXR is simply to point out that by using this, if I want to grab all my passes, all I got to do is, again, put a transform node in here. Rename one. Let's call this one over here, the one we just added. We're going to call this depth. All right, and we're going to call this one over here. We're going to go over the node. We're going to call this mist. All right, that way we can look at the two of them separately. And then back on the controls page for this one, we're going to switch this one over to the mist, and then on this one, we're going to go over the controls, uncheck all planes, and change our source layer to the depth. All right, so there we go. And we look at it just by selecting which one. All right, so there we go, and that lets us see the two. And you can see they look very different. And as I said last time, when you look at the depth inside of Natron or in any program, even when it's rendered correctly, it looks like just white usually. And there's a reason for that, and we're going to get into that in a minute. But before we do, I want to point out why I don't recommend PNGs. I'm going to just... This file has all the... This is our first reason why I recommend using EXRs over PNGs, is because you only have to deal with one file and you access the layers using something as simple as a transform node to pick out your layer information, and you can do all your offsets and so forth. But it's very easy to pick. I mean, we just have our small list, or well, it's kind of hard to see over here because it's running. The list is running behind my face, but it's a short list. It just shows all the layers that all the passes that I've set up to render with this file. Whereas if I take my PNGs and I drag my PNGs in here, we wind up with, if this works, we wind up with this, and this is just this chaotic thing, and we have all these things, and it says read node, and you'll notice that by default, when you make renders inside of Blender, you can name your you usually render to subfolders. I recommend rendering to subfolders so that all your animations stay unique. But you also should rename your things, and I didn't rename them specifically here. Let's pop over into Blender for a second. You'll see here I don't have any of these things named. I just left them at by the default, which it happens to be image. So the image substring, every one of these things is called image. Well, this happens to a lot of people. So what happens is if somebody hasn't done that and you're working on a project for somebody and they haven't done it, when you pull it into Natron, you get all these nodes and they're all called image. But it doesn't help you. It doesn't tell you what it is unless you look at the actually select it. If you double click on one and you, there we go. And we look at it, we can look at it, for example, I can do, all right, that's my difference color, all right, I can put that over here. I really don't need that one, don't need this one, I don't need, here, this is going to be either that one, oh, wait a minute, oh, there's a normal pass. You know what, we don't need half of this. I'm going to get rid of ones we don't need. So I don't think we need this one. Let's just look at these. That one, don't need, don't care about. Let's see, this one, what's this? This is, oh, ambient occlusion, don't need it. Let's look at this one. This is probably illumination of some form. This is diffuse. This says it's the diffuse color. I question that one. That doesn't look like diffuse color to me. Anyway, I think I flubbed that one. But anyway, we're going off. So this would be the direct right there. So without the motion blur on it, or without the, excuse me, the depth of field on it. This one, it looks like it's maybe the, what is this? This is a shade. I don't know, it doesn't really matter to me. This is a final render. Anyway, it's either going to be this one or that one, and we need the mist. I want to find the mist. This is going to be the mist right here. Yep, that's on mist. All right. So we're going to delete that one, that one, that one. And what all I did is I dragged my folder that had all the different layers in it. So first problem is of course, I've got all these layers. They're all not named properly. If I'd named them properly in Blender, but you're dealing with, you're not necessarily going to be the person who creates this stuff. Not always. Not if you're a compositor. You're going to be dealing with people's files. So if somebody gives you these, this is the first headache you run into, is that your passes aren't guaranteed to render unless you're dealing with somebody who knows that they need to render them properly. They think, oh, well, I've rendered it out to properly named folders. Anyway, so that's just the first thing. Second thing, well, let's see, what do we got here? This is a Z depth. Oh yes, and this is, oh, that's just the alpha. We don't need that one. And let's see, what's this? That's the final output. Yeah, all right. So, here is basically our mist pass. Which, by the way, if we look at the two, first thing we're going to notice is that inside of Natron, they look different. That's interesting. Why is that? Why would the mist pass look different between these two files? Well, that comes down to the difference between PNGs and EXR files. EXR files by default are set to, they automatically are linear color space, whereas PNG as a file format is actually RGB. And believe it or not, Blender actually renders them as RGB. And you said, whoa, that's not true, Preamble. It renders them as linear. I can prove it. You know what? We can prove it. Well, it's default. We can see that in Natron when we pull this up. By default, it's saying that it's sRGB. Well, it should be linear because, it did render it as linear, but it didn't render it as linear. And I'll show you in a little while what I mean. So here we go. We switch over the color space to linear because Blender rendered it as linear. So here we go. We're looking at a linear. They're both the same. So that's the next thing. We have to actually force all the images from Blender when we get them into Natron. If we render them as PNGs, we have to force them to be linear color space because they're not, PNGs by default are not linear color space when you pull them in. They're not expected to be. All right, it's considered an oddity to not do it. And I'll show that Blender actually doesn't always render to it in a minute. We're going to break Blender. Keep saying that because we're gonna. All right, so now we see that, so that solves the problem there. All right, so let's go over to our Blender This is all Z-pass. All right, well, first thing we want to do is change this from sRGB to linear, because we know that that is what it needs to be. And then we want to go over to our transform depth for here. All right, so we have these two things. We don't see anything in here. The reason we don't see anything is, as I said last time, or last week, we need to normalize this file, or sort of normalize it. What we really have to understand is that the Z depth is actually this is 16-bit. By the way, these were rendered out in Blender as 16-bit EXRs, not 32-bit, because I wanted to keep them on the same level playing field with the PNGs. Even though the EXRs can go up to 32-bit, PNGs are going to be restricted to 16-bit. Honestly, really doesn't matter. You should never have to go beyond 16-bit for color depth. Anyway, so we'll just keep it at 16-bit. We're going to keep it there. We're not going to go into the details of why one might want it to go. So why are we not seeing this with our depth pass? Well, let's do it correctly first, just to prove that this is all there. We're going to put in a grade node. So I'm going to hit G and put in our grade node here. And as I said last time, if we hit normalize, it's going to normalize our values. And the thing I've said that PNG works on is, even though it's 16-bit, it works in what's called the 0 to 1 color value, color range. In other words, it's proper term for it is I would say it was integer, even though that's really not necessarily true. It's floating point, but when you're dealing with floating point numbers, nothing. How do you represent 65,000 colors, right? Let's pull up, actually, let's do some math here. 2 to the power of 16 tells us how many colors we wind up per channel, all right? Or how many colors there are. 2 to the power of 16-bit is 65,536 things. So that's how many variations we're gonna copy that right there, all right? And to truly grade this properly, what we really want to do inside of Natron is change our white point from 1 to that number, 65,536. When I do that to our EXR file, watch what happens. We wind up with this as our final image, as our image. And you say to yourself, whoa, where did that come from? Well, the thing is that it's a 32-bit EXR. There are literally 65,000 different values. It keeps going up. It even goes up higher than that. We could make it way higher. We can go up to 32-bit in this. Well, I don't know if Natron would go higher than that, but we're not going to get into that right now. The point is that right now we're looking at this with giving each value a single incremental number from 1 to 65,000. All right. When we hit normalize, all right, what normalize is going to do is it's going to look for our brightest value and it's going to look at our darkest value, and it's going to automatically set our black point to the darkest value and our lightest point to the lightest value. So this is actually going to change this ever so slightly. So if I hit normalize, what happened is, whoa, that's weird. Well, that is weird. That just broke a little bit there. Huh. Will all be. I don't know why that, zero that. Huh. Well, that's Natron's acting a little weird here. Normally that should put a white there. You know what it might be? Ooh. No. Well, let's try normalizing with alpha, clamping the black, unpre-multiplied. Oh, there we go. We got to unpre-multiply it. There we go. All right. So, I was just dealing with it for that. I didn't realize it did that. That's weird. Anyway, doesn't matter. Point is, so there we go. It's adjusted it. We can we can see that it has, it says that our black point is actually at a value of 10, which means that our darkest point in this image is actually not 0, it's actually 10, or 10.1 point, some ridiculous floating point value, which is ridiculous. We don't need it. We're going to just set that to 0. And here we can see that we got 65, our lightest point is 65,550, or 504. Okay, so it's not even the full range. And then it goes into like, oh no, it doesn't go into decimal point. So there we go. Our white isn't actually white. It's sort of there. So anyway, we're going to paste that number back so that we have our value set here. So it's 65,500 and whatever. All right. So it's great. We've solved the problem. There's our image. You're saying to yourself, well, Power Bill, it doesn't look like it's actually there. Well, the problem is that the way this is working is it's way more. Every one of these numbers represents a position in space from the camera all the way back into, for in this case, 65,500 positions, units of space, of depth, back in space. And or that represents, quote, infinity, so to speak, via whatever the far clipping plane is on our image. The problem is our cube in this case is so close to the camera that it's basically in the black range. It's not that it's actually black, it just happens to be very, very low. So if we take this down, let's get rid of a lot of this. Let's go over here. Let's get rid of everything but that last 36. And so we only look at 36 units. And when we do that, we start seeing shades here. If we take this up, we start going up into 36. We can see that if we go up around, actually let's keep it at 36, and now we can see that because we've reduced our normalization range down to 36 units, we can see that that the white point, or that we get a lot more shading, but we're not seeing much black anymore. Now it looks very gray. Well, if we start raising this up to that 10, remember it said that the darkest point was 10. Well, that's the edge of the cube. It was 10 point something. Well, look at that. Our range for our cube looks to be somewhere around 30s. If we were to get the entire shading range of where our cube exists, we can see it exists somewhere. We're starting to lose information somewhere around 25 or so, somewhere between 20 and 25. So that's basically our shading range. That's the depth of where in all of those values this cube's space exists, if that makes sense. The reason that went up to, when we normalized it, went all the way up is because the background color is actually up at that higher end. It's up near 65,000. It's actually at 65,504, as we saw. So the white isn't pure white in this case, but that's all besides the point. So there we go. There we're seeing it. We have a cube. We have Z information, and it's fully smooth. We've got all this detail. We can do something with this, and this is what zDefocus works off of. Is this type of map? It needs this much information. It's designed to work with this much space, and that first number digit that we were dealing with was setting up where the focal plane is on our image. It would basically, in this case, that's saying where is the camera in focus, and then you have your rear focus and you have your forward focus. All right, that's what it works with. In the case of so that's what it's supposed to do. Now let's take a look at our PNG version of this file. You notice I've copied our grade over here. I'm going to reset this so that we're working with on an equal playing field. We're looking over here. All right, we'll hook up our gradient to our Z depth, and we connect to it, and then we say to ourselves, aha, we already know what we got to do. We have to hit this normalize button. And what happened? We normalized, and everything disappeared. In fact, it says black point is 1, white point is 1. Why is that? As I said in the last episode, the problem with PNG is that it works in a color space, and the range for it is between 0 and 1. All the 65,000 are decimals between 0 and 1, the percentages, or well, not really percentages, but they're decimals, floating points that exist in that space. So the problem is we don't have anything. There is nothing. This is basically an empty image. It's as good as nothing. And you say to yourself, that's really weird. Why is Blender doing that? Well, that is where we're gonna pop back into Blender for a second, just to look at that. What the problem is that Blender's design is basically looking at the image, and it's because it's rendering it out, it doesn't first convert that 65,000. It doesn't divide the resulting image, the depth map, down by 65,500. Well, we can fix that inside of Blender, and we're doing some Blender here, so we hit Shift I. We're gonna go over to, I think it's filter. Where's math? Thought it was under here. Convert math. There we go. Math. We do add a math node in here. I think you hold down, I think it's Shift, and it puts it in. Yeah, there we go. Do a little Shift. We'll put this into divide. We got our value there. We're going to go over here. We're going to say, we're going to paste in our value there. There's our 65,536 units. That's what we've got to divide it by in order to render this out as a PNG. And you find yourself, okay, that makes sense, right? That makes total sense. Let's render this out. In fact, wait a minute. Did I put that? I put it on the wrong thing. That's a mist. That wouldn't do. We want to, we missed it. In fact, what we're going to do, well, did not want to do that. Control Z. Z. Come on, undo it. Blender, there we go. Good. Good program. All right, so we're going to take our Z depth here, and I'm going to just copy this, or no, excuse me, Alt Shift duplicate this over. So, and then we're going to take our wire, our depth up to here to the first value, and then connect this up to our second value. And here, I'm just going to make this Z depth 1, so that when I render this, which won't take very long at all, render, I'm going to render my animation. It's an animation of exactly 1 frame. There we go. That took so long. And we're going to go back into I'm going to grab my PNG sequences. We're going to pop back into Natron here. And we're going to, let me find Z depth 1 and drop that in here. So now you'll notice that when I drop that in, first thing that we see, lo and behold, when we look at this is, hey, that looks a heck of a lot like what this did. What that did would be, or well, actually, part of the reason that this is not is because I believe this, we're doing something over here. Oh, let's set that to none. Huh. That still shouldn't be doing whatever. All right, well, that is weird. That is really weird, but whatever. We can see that it looked a lot like what our grade node over here did. If we, when we just used it, there. Let's go back over to this. Connect this up. Set this to 0. Set this to 65,536. So this and this look very similar. All right. So this tells us that if we take that grade, this grade here, and apply the same grade to that, maybe we should wind up with something similar, right? Nope, it's not working. Why isn't it working? Well, because the problem is that, again, this is working. This still is 0 to 1. There is all that same information here. Actually, I just deleted my grade node and I didn't want to, but that's okay. What we're gonna do is we're gonna take this down, and instead of doing it by increasing the numbers, what we're gonna do is do it by changing decimal points. So we're just gonna pretend that we're shifting decimal points over. So we're gonna go like 0.0001, and then, oh, look at that, there we go. We're starting to get down there. We might want to put another 0 in there. Nope, that's too far, so we're going to just take it up. We'll take this up. So, all right, so there we go. So we can see that 0.009 to 1-ish, somewhere in there, we start seeing something, but it looks funny, and we'll get into this in a minute. We're going to try and fix that. Let's go over here. So the problem is, of course, our black point is not set. We said we'll do 000, and we're going to just take and up the black point just ever so slightly, maybe not that much. Let's go up a little bit more casually. So there we go. All right, so now we're starting to see we have a Z-buff or Z-buffer from Blender, but it's looking weird. Why is it looking weird? This does not look correct. Well, let's first see if the problem is that this is coming in, it's seeing this as RGB. Let's change it from RGB to linear. All right, that changed it, but did it change it correctly? Let's find out. All right, no, we lost everything. Let's figure out why. Let's change this up. Oh, aha. So what it did is it shifted it up so that it's actually at a higher value. Did that fix the problem? It didn't really fix the problem. We still have the same problem. Basically, what we're seeing is that Blender isn't actually rendering this out in a linear color, in a linear form. It's actually rendering this pass out in an RGB form, because if it were rendering out in linear, we would have wound up with this as a result. Or actually, we would have wound up with this as a result, which would have translated when we did all this stuff. It should have wound up looking like this. How do I know? Well, we can actually export this from inside of Blender, or excuse me, from inside of Natron, so that we can write this out, and we can write it out in the two forms. Unfortunately, as far as I know, Blender does not have the ability to render this out that way. So I'm not 100% sure if we can salvage this. Let's try playing around with a few things. Let's try shifting this from RGB back to linear, or excuse me, shift this back to RGB. And then back this, try setting this to RGB. Let's set both of them to RGB. Nope, that just did the exact same thing. It doesn't fix it. What it really is we want it to be, it really needs to be sRGB. Blender actually needs to either write it in an actual linear format into the sRGB, or it needs to render it in a different way. So let's find out. Let's try and prove that this is a problem on Blender, with how Blender's rendering this. So we're going to do a right node. So we're going to hit W to put a right node. Let me put this off my screen for a minute, because that's, you know what? I'm going to go over here. I'm just going to go into this. I've made a folder called Natron EXR in this little output folder. We're going to call this Natron ZDOC. Let's see, EXR to PNG. All right, this is what we're going to do, and we're going to put a couple of hashtags to represent our values, and then we're going to go .png like so. All right, so we're going to save this as a PNG like so. All right. And I'm going to just, inside of Natron, I'm going to take this output here. We've already converted this down. Remember, right now, what we're seeing here out of this node is what we basically did inside of Blender. We basically have taken and compressed this. We divided it. We've normalized it down. I suppose we could do it by math as well. We could try doing, I don't know if Natron has a general math developed by node math. Now we can do multiply, which we could do the math. Nah, it's just not worth it. We can just use, it's easier to do set a white point in our grade node, and we're just as good. We've already got it. All right, so there we go. So we have this, we go over here, we've got this set up. We need to tell it that we want this to, instead of being 8-bit, we want this to be 16-bit, because obviously we want more colors. And for right now, we're going to tell it, we're going to do what we think it should be. We're going to tell it that it's a linear color space. All right, we're going to tell it linear. All right. Let's first, I think that I want to make sure that I'm doing this right. Oh, we're going to hit render. Oh, crumbs. Oh no, we got to stop that. I'm rendering out a whole lot of frames. Forgot to set my frame range. Change the frame range. Frame range manual. We only want one frame. There we go. Last frame. There we go. All right. So now we will only want to render that, and I'm going to go over, and I have that, should have this already open over here, and that's weird. There we go. Interesting. We are getting the EXR over here. So now we have this, and it's looking weird. This is not looking right. I think part of the problem is that we are rendering this with a, I think I know what the problem is. I think the problem, no. That is interesting. Let's see. Alpha, no. Natron's doing some weird stuff here. All right, it's saying that that's PNG. Let's see, that's RGB. Unpremultiplied, opaque. Let's tell it premultiplied. No. All right. Let's try this. Let's clamp the black. Try rendering this. One more time. This was working earlier. Oh, Natron, Natron, Natron. Why are you giving me a lip? Oh, I'm getting lip big time. 16-bit. We got that set. Let me just compare this to my original sample I've got over here. Where did I write? Make sure everything is set up correctly. All right, there's my EXR. Got my grade node set. According to this, I want unpremultiplied. I want clamp black is off. 65,500. We should be good. Is there an alpha? No, it's just RGB. That's one of the problems. Okay. You know what? We're going to change this so that instead of being RGBA, I'm going to just set this to RGB. Okay. For our file format. We're not going to worry about the alpha for this. There. All right, let's try this one more time. Let's render that. There we go. All right. So here's a PNG. And there we go. We can see our PNG here. We got it set. Now let me just double check this. I want to make sure All right. So I'm doing linear color space here. I've told it that I wanted the file output to be color. Oh, excuse me. I told it here that we want to use linear color space. I told it here we're using linear color space. We're going to take the grade node here, and we're going to put this on here. And lo and behold, when we do it linear color space, look at this. This is a problem. This is a fundamental problem with PNG, which is PNG does not like working with linear color space. It just doesn't. You're saying, oh, that's just a problem with PNG. Well, is it? Is it really? Watch what happens if we take our file output here, and instead of telling it that we want the file color space in here to be linear, if we want to tell it to be RGB for the writing, if we tell it to render it out now, it's rendered. We should be able to reload that. Let's reload this file. Now it looks different. Something happened. Something weird happened. Well, let's go over to our grade node. Let's hit normalize. Okay, it looks good here. Let's reset these all to match. And we can see, first of all, let's set our black point. Well, we'll keep our black point there. So we'll see. All right, first of all, this is a big thing. You'll notice that all these values, we have values here between 0 and 1, except for in decimal points. Well, our normalize worked, and it did basically the same thing, but it worked from 0 to 1, where our white point is now 99,000, etc. Watch what happens if we start eliminating these 9s. So let's check these 9s, and let's just change that one to a 0. Actually, let's change 2 of them to 0s. And lo and behold, now, when we rendered it out to RGB color space, which is what PNG expects to be, we can see that it actually rendered it properly. So both, if we set it so that it tries to render linear to a PNG file, despite it being an actual linear, supposedly linear information, that linear information isn't actually getting saved properly. It needs, in order for it to save properly, we need to render it out as an RGB 16-bit in order for it to actually use that color space correctly for this map, to get the information, to get the resolution, so that we actually can use it. So this is a problem. It's a problem if you, obviously, because we can switch between RGB color space and linear color space for rendering inside of Natron. We can fix the problem inside of Natron. But the problem is that no such option exists inside of the file output node here inside of Blender. And now I believe you can change the entire color space of Blender underneath its preferences somewhere, and I'm not going to go into that because that's going to change whether that will change the output method for all of the color spaces. It's not on a channel or on a node by node basis like it is inside of Natron, which limits Blender in the sense for color compositing, for exporting and so forth. So the problem that this creates is either they need to fix this inside of Blender so that it renders correctly, or does the proper conversion so that when it saves it in linear color space, that you can actually import it into, well, let's actually, no, let me think about this for a moment. Yes, no, it won't. We tried it. It won't. I don't think it will. All right, I'm going to try one more thing over inside of Natron. Whoops, I moved something I didn't mean to move. Oh well, that's we're going to go over in Natron. We're going to look at the this is the image file from Blender. We said, got one more thought process we might try doing, which is we said that this was linear color space, right? And we hit, you know what, I actually want to just put this over here for the moment. I'm going to put a new grade onto this one, and we're going to hit normalize this. Right, let's get this down. Well, that's fascinating. Why is the black point at 1.8? Whoa, that's really weird. It shouldn't be. Why is that 1? Let's 0 that. Oh, it's a negative exponent. That's why. I don't know. We're gonna just normalize. Oh, we're gonna reset this. Reset it. Our white point should be at 0. Our black point should be lower than 0. We want to keep going down until we already know this. We're saying it's 0001, right? Shouldn't be actually negative. It should be 0.001. There we go. So black point, white point should be 1. Excuse me. This should be 1. There we go. Now we want to bring this down. All right. Crawling out loud. We want this way down. Way down. All right. So keep going. We're starting to get into the realms. So there we go. All right, so I just wanted this there so that we could just see what happens if we set this from sRGB in to sRGB out. Maybe that will fix the problem. What happens if we go to try and normalize it? Okay. What are we dealing with here? All right. We want to bring this down. We want to get rid of these zeros. Zero those two. Nope. Need to keep going. Hopefully. Nope. Nothing we're doing is going to solve the problem. There's just zero we can do. So Blender is not rendering it out into a functional format that we can actually use. So the problem that this rate or point or the thing this brings up is that Blender can't or currently isn't rendering PNGs properly. It does not render the depth pass correctly. There's nothing we can do inside of Blender unless we go in and create a custom ramp that ramps it out and tries to redistribute that onto whatever format it wants it to be in. But we'd have to probably normalize it, which is the whole reason the reason this doesn't exist, or the fact that this doesn't exist or doesn't work properly, is part of the reason that the mist channel exists, or the mist output exists inside of Blender anyhow, because this is basically, if we look at this, it is basically the same thing as what this would be if we graded it down like this. So if we look at this and we look at that, these two things are very, very, very similar. That's the mist. This is the other, this is our actual thing. If we set this to 0, we can see that we could probably just sit here and play with this a little bit and get the two. Let's do this, hit W, and look at these two side by side. And if we go into our grade node, we can actually get, so this is on the right is our actual depth channel, the real Z depth, whereas this is the mist channel, which we see over on the left. So if we can see that it's literally the same thing. The only difference is that it's been normalized in some form. I mean, it isn't normalized in the same way that Natron normalizes it, but what it has been done is that the black level has been brought up a bit. So we're going to bring this up. So let's see. Let's try and get that in. Let's find out. Let's find our, you know what? Here's an easy little trick we can do. Over here, let's turn off W for a minute. Let's just look at this, and we're going to go to under our, I believe it's under other, image statistics. If we go over here and we go over to minimum max and we hit analyze this frame, all right, it tells us. So it will show us where our minimum and maximum luminance pixels are. So here's our minimum pixel right here. And it's saying that our minimum luminance pixel is this value right here, which is 0.048. So if I just take this, I can just go in here and I can, if I literally click on this, I can just add that to my custom colors, hopefully. It's saying it's 62. By the way, but we can sit here, we can just copy one of these, copy that so that we're working with it in actual 32-bit color space, and we go over to our grade node. Where is it? No, to this grade node right here. I'm just trying to think, is that right? Is that going to give us, no, it's not, because it's not normalized. Okay, we need to do a little math. All right, so we say 1 divided by 65,536, right? That gives us our increments, and we want to multiply that times answer times paste. This should give us, so it wants us to give us a value of 2. 2. Interesting. That's not what I would have thought. Well, all right, maybe that was, I thought I was going to get something useful out of that, but I don't think we are. Oh well. Let's see. All right, so we want 2 is there Why are we not seeing our... All right, so now our values are on the left, and I think let's see, no, let's bring this back a little bit. So 9 is possibly too low. Maybe it's just on. All right, and then we want to take our white point down or up. We're going to just try and do this by eye. We can kind of see, this is just playing around. So I think we passed our area where our white was close to it. But it looks like it's very similar, as we can see. We can... In fact, we're having some issues in here too, which is that the zDepth does not have anti-aliasing to it, whereas the anti-aliasing, the mispass, which makes the mispass in a lot of ways possibly better for compositing inside of Blender. Well, I would hope that whatever program was used would fix it. But anyway, so the whole point of this is to look at the depth pass. This is the actual depth pass. This is a real zDepth, and this is looking at it correctly inside of Natron, rendered from Blender as an EXR. We can see the difference, and this goes to show an advantage to using it. It just goes to show that there's a lot more depth to zDepth than there is to the mispass, first of all, and B, that the EXR file gets the entire zDepth, whereas there's no way to really outside of or inside of Blender export a PNG with a true depth pass other than using the mispass. So you'd have to use the mist file to mimic your depth or to mimic it, and that's unfortunate. Because zDefocus does not work with, or is not really compatible with the mispass, and as we can see, just trying to normalize it and trick it and get it down into the same sort of range didn't really work. We'd have to, I mean, we could tweak it for a long time, but we're getting back into that whole, is it worth playing with to try and fix it to make it fit into something that you would normally get by default by using an EXR? And the answer is, I don't think it's worth it. I think if you're going to use zDefocus, that you really want to stick with using an EXR file. Now, the big argument for using a series of PNGs over using EXR is physically the file size. And this is going to get into the next little tidbit of just as a thought in some sharing on this. So I am going to just for a moment pop over into my layers here, and I wanted to bring this up because I'm going to bring up the properties of this folder here, and we can see that this folder is 5.2 megabytes for all the passes. Now, admittedly, there are more passes. I think I have a total of, I don't know, I did all the passes that were available outside of Blend, or in the Blender node that I could hook up. I hooked them up and I rendered them out to individual files. Plus, there's one extra file because we made an extra ZPass. But we're talking we're talking somewhere between probably 3 to 5 megabytes for all of those files. All right, well, let's look at, inside of this, I also created this here, and we can see that these are various EXR formats here, rendered out the same way. Now, the typical one that is used uses zip compression, which is a lossless compression. It's the smallest file size of EXR without losing any image quality and so forth, and or without losing anything. It's a pure color, pixel per pixel, color for color representation. But there's another format that's actually, well, there's a couple of formats that are actually better, but the most interesting one to talk about is one called DWAA. And you probably have seen it. In fact, we can, well, let's actually pop over. We can actually do these on, if we change the format of this to well, the goal behind this is actually to sort of tell people or help people out with over here inside of Blender, for Blender users who are trying to, because that's a very popular, most people who are using Natron for compositing are going to be rendering probably from Blender. So the big question here is in here we see that the codecs, we have these codecs, and inside of here there's this thing called DWAA. And you might say you'll notice next to it you see this thing that says lossy, and go, oh poor Bill, I didn't want to do lossiness. Lossy's bad, evil stuff, dealing with lossy stuff. You know what? There are times when losing information is bad. JPEGs are bad because JPEGs lose information in a fundamental way. And one of the big problems when you're dealing with video, when you're filming something outside with a digital cinema camera or even a non-digital cinema camera, when you're dealing with a camera, the problem is you're trying to capture as much of the information that the sensor is providing to a file. And so when you go into compressed formats with an image sensor, you're compromising the light data that has been gathered by the sensor. And the sensor is the dynamic range of the sensor at this point in time will never ever be as good as what the dynamic range of the universe is. You are limited. It doesn't matter what they tell you, we are going to be, even if they say there's 15 stops, it's hogwash. There's only so much information. I mean, you can get 15 stops. Let me back up here. I don't want to say you can't get 15 stops. You can get 15 stops, but there's compromises made with these things. You have to understand there's always a compromise somewhere in the image data. 15 stops of dynamic range, sure, you can get a gray that's at a different point, but does it have functional stops or functional scales or values between those stops? There's all kinds of things that nitty-gritty that come out with sensors. But anyway, this wasn't really my point behind that. My point behind the video and so forth is when you're dealing with camera data, you want to try to capture all that data to the best of your ability, because you want to capture as much of reality as possible to give you the most, especially when dealing in a movie level, with you want the potential to grade and fix, or if something went wrong, you want the ability to correct it in post. That's part of the point behind compositing, is they can do, you can use that information. The more information you have, the easier it is to pick out pieces for tracking purposes, for doing all kinds of interesting stuff. So from that standpoint, it's really useful. From rendering in programs like in 3D programs, the compression you're talking about is the equivalent of applying a noise reduction to your pass. It's not the level of, it's not the same thing. It's not lossy with the talk of DWA compression. First of all, DWA, for people who don't know what DWA stands for, TWA stands for DreamWorks Animation, okay? Because DreamWorks is the company that created that file format compression. It's a form of discrete cosine transformations, I believe it is. Is the compression type. It's basically the equivalent. It uses sine waves or waveforms. Wavelet is another form format, like JPEG and so forth. It uses waveforms as a compression form, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But the thing that you have to understand with it when you're rendering these things out is, yes, it's a lossy format. DWI is or DWAA. The A after the DWA is DreamWorks animation, and A is the type of compression. There's A compression and B compression. A compression I think has 32 samples or 64 samples or something like that, and then the B compression has 256 samples. So A is like the simplest of simple, but it really doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things, because you're dealing with what we're dealing with is something that's a final image format. Most DreamWorks actually renders out to DWA format, or at least that's my understanding from people I know that work there, or that did work there. I don't know if they still do. Anyway, they render to it because it's a much smaller format. In fact, if we look at that file list I had right here, we can see that the one that we did, the DWA, is only 1.7 megabytes, and that contains all of the information. All right, all the same information, or pretty much all the same information. If we go into here now, again, there is going to be data loss, but it isn't the question. It's the equivalent of applying a noise reduction, and it's really not going to alter your final image all that much. The only time it really matters that you should never compress is when you're actually is not at the source. Your source, your source. Okay, remember, with a camera, your source is actually the outside. Okay. With computer animation, your source is this file. Your full file format is your actual source, because you can render out as clean an image as you need it to be. And what you get, the difference between DWA compression and a different renderer is going to be much greater. If you rendered out in Arnold or in V-Ray or in Cycles, they're all different. Each one of those is going to have a greater impact on the final result than switching over between zip and DWA. So if your goal, the whole reason I'm making this argument is from the goal standpoint that a lot of people make the claim that you want to render out to PNGs because they are a smaller file. Well, you can make. We just saw that the whole folder of PNGs was 5 megabytes, and that's for a single file, and or a single frame of each one of those. And we saw that the one file format, I mean, the one of these files is all of these are basically, or almost all of these, not all of them actually, these ones are much bigger down here. But if we go down here, this one here is zip. These two here are basically zip, and you can see, yeah, I'll have one marked zip, and this is the actual one we just rendered inside of Blender. You can see they're the same size. They're 3.9 megabytes. Okay, so it's actually technically smaller for that than all the other passes. Now, make of that what you will. The whole point is if you're really after a smaller file size, you can go to DWI, then you can get something that's a fraction, or under, or almost half of the, no, it's actually under half of the size of a zip version if you're willing to lose it. And it's not going to look that horrible. People use that, especially when you get to movie length things. That level of compression over, 2 hours worth of footage, this is not so bad. It's a pretty decent compromise, and you wind up with a really decent looking image. And so I bring that up. So that is my arguments. My whole point behind this is to make the arguments that people really need to think when they're rendering out from things. Should you render to PNG, which you have to deal with a messy bunch of files, you have to deal with multiple files, versus a single file. You have to deal with the fact that inside of Blender, at least, the different passes, and by the way, the mispass we saw, we can get the mispass with both, but the difference is the passes come in correctly graded, they're in the proper format already when you pull them into Natron. That's reason number 2. They come in correctly, beyond which they render correctly from Blender itself, because we saw that the depth map doesn't render properly. And 3, we can make the files the file size per frame actually smaller than the equivalent amount of render passes that we would have if we were using PNG. If we wanted to use PNG, we could make it significantly smaller, or arguably smaller, because really a single EXR in zip format, which is the smallest, was from what we saw, was still a little bit smaller than our entire compressed folder worth of PNGs. So make of that what you will. That is the goal. That was the argument. I've made my case and I've pointed this out, and the goal was to also explain what the big difference between the PNG working between 0 and 1 for its 65,000 colors, and EXR, which works in a color space that allows to go beyond and up to 65,000 or higher, because we can go up to 32-bit color depth. Anyway, getting off my soapbox. So yeah, thanks. Yeah, well, let's see. Thanks for watching. Keep on Natroning.